Where the Second World War reshaped the landscape of Europe and reset the relationship of the Soviet Union and the West, creating the Cold War, it was World War I that created the modern Middle East, including most of the myriad issues we see there today. The European component of World War I lasted from 1914 through 1918. However, the Middle East continued in turmoil after the European phase of the conflict ended. It took until the early 1920s for the open hostilities to wind down in the Middle East. Then, over the ensuing decades, the region slowly morphed into what we see today. In order to understand how we got to where we are now, we have to start with the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was a Turkish empire. It was run largely by Turks from Istanbul, then known as Constantinople. It lasted for about 600 years and ended with the conclusion of World War I. During its greatest geographical expanse, it stretched from southeastern Europe through modern Turkey, through most of the Middle East, and included most of North Africa. This map shows that greatest extent of the Ottoman Empire superimposed on a modern map of the area. You can see that the entire Eastern Mediterranean, the Balkans, almost all of the Black Sea area, the Red Sea area, all the way to the Persian Gulf. In other words, lots of modern states would be subsumed into the Ottoman Empire at its greatest extent if it existed today. At the start of World War I, this is what remained of the Ottoman Realm, and even parts of this were only nominally under their control. If you look, you can see that while the western coastal portion of the Arabian Peninsula was still controlled by the Turks, the interior, circled in red, was not. Indeed, the Turkish military avoided that area. Even the coast was tenuously controlled. By the time the war was beginning, the British had already established control of some of the ports along the Red Sea. This map illustrates the various powers controlling and operating in the Middle East and North Africa at the time the war was beginning. Here's who the players were, but before I go through them, notice who does not control most of the area. The indigenous people of the area have very little control over their own landscape. You can see here the remainder of the Ottoman Empire. Over in the western part of this map, you can see Spain had some control over areas that would be in modern Morocco. The French had control over what would be Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. Italy was controlling what would be modern Libya. The British controlled Egypt, Sudan, what would be Yemen, Oman, the UAE, and then parts of Afghanistan, and of course over through Pakistan and India. The Russians were in control of what would be modern-day northern Iran. The Arabs did have control of the central Arabian Peninsula, and the Persians controlled the southern part of what would be modern Iran. This map shows the major offensives in the Middle East. Pay close attention to the British and Arab offensives. You can see here the red arrows indicate the British movements in the war. This was towards the end of the war. They come up through Mesopotamia and they come up along the Levant, which is the eastern Mediterranean coast. The red and blue arrows are the British and the French at Gallipoli. The green arrows are the Arab Revolt beginning in 1916. These other green arrows are the Russians invading what would be modern-day Turkey. And then these brown arrows are early offensives by the Ottomans. Now we can see, from a geographical standpoint, where and why those movements were the way they were. This map takes some explaining. You're probably familiar with the very famous Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence was a member of the British military. He was at first stationed in Cairo, which was under British control. He spoke Arabic fluently. He was the one Westerner that the Arabs allowed into the Arabian Peninsula. The Arabian Peninsula, because of Islam in general, and Mecca and Medina in particular, is considered holy ground for Muslims. And they were, and many still are, uninterested in non-Muslims trotting on that ground. But Lawrence was an exception. He was trusted. He lived like the Bedouin Arabs. He rode camels and respected their culture. He also operated as the liaison between the Arabs and the British. The British were hoping to convince the Arabs to revolt against the Ottomans and thereby open another front in the war. That way, the British felt the Turkish military would not be able to defend that new front, and if they tried, it would result in the collapse of the European theater of operations for the Germans, the Austrians, and the Ottomans, and bring the war to an end. But the Arabs of the Arabian Peninsula are Muslims. The Turks are Muslims. Being ruled by a Muslim empire was one thing. Being ruled by a Western Christian power would be a completely different thing. What do if you're the British? You promise something to the Arabs. What they promised is what you see on that map. First, almost the entirety of the Middle East would be under the control of one single unified Arab government. This was the quid pro quo. And the British would control these areas. Why the area in modern-day Iraq? Oil. The British had begun to convert their navy to an oil-based rather than coal-based navy at the end of the 19th century. The Mediterranean coast was to be negotiated at a later date. Lawrence conveyed this deal to the Arab leadership, and that is what they thought they would get when they revolted and the war ended. At the same time, the British and French secretly negotiated the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which you can see on these maps. Although the majority of the Arabian Peninsula was to be in the hands of the Arabs, the rest of the Middle East was to be either directly or indirectly under the control of the British and the French. Notice the shapes that you see playing out on that landscape. By 1923, and largely as a result of the negotiations that took place at Versailles after the war, the Europeans created what were known as mandates. Look at those shapes. Do you recognize them? Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, Kuwait, Lebanon. They are all appearing, but never existed prior, even Lebanon. This is the modern Middle East. These were the mandates. This is the modern Middle East. Now, just for some added excitement, this is a map of ethnicity in the Middle East. Imagine trying to give each and every ethnic group its own country. Good luck. That means the nature of boundary drawing would bake animosity into the cake. And this map shows the distribution of Sunnis and Shiites throughout the region. Do they fit well into borders? Some do, some don't. Let's take a look one more time at a country we met before. Remember Iraq? Diversity. And it's diversity that does not fit into borders easily, nor has been shown since the Iraq War to be much of a viable state in terms of national unity as Iraqis. The prism is to see oneself as one's group or ethnicity or clan or whatever, but not necessarily one's quote-unquote nationality. Again, let's look at these maps and think about how to divvy up that region equitably. Sykes-Picot, mandates, modern Middle East. Because of the many recent wars there has been discussion about a realignment in the region. This map is one of the possible conceptions. You can see in southern Iraq a Shiite state. Through western Iraq and eastern Syria, a Sunni state. And along the coast, an Alawite state. Bashar al-Assad, the savage dictator of Syria, is a member of the minority Alawite Shiite sect that ran Syria until the civil war for decades. And I would add, is closely aligned with the Russians. And if you look up in the north, there you can see a Kurdish state, the long-held dream of the Kurds. And then there's this. Many countries in the region have geometric boundaries. A geometric boundary is a straight line boundary drawn without cultural considerations. Why ignore all of these complexities? Well, the Europeans had a proclivity for that. seeing the world at that time as being a place to control and colonize. They saw the collapse of the Ottoman Empire as freeing up the last place on Earth that could be colonized by Europeans. Ethnic complexity was secondary to those factors. Ultimately, as borders were drawn, they paid more attention to things like natural resources, especially oil, cooperative ruling families, and the thing they didn't concern themselves about were ethnic, religious, and clan associations and ties. See any straight lines? And here we are.